Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Where's my laptop real quick? Want to thank everyone for joining us here today, whether in person or online. I also want to extend my appreciation to Dr. Ernest Van Eck for inviting me here today and to Jenna Lee for facilitating this as well. It's wonderful to be back at Knox. It's been a few years since I was at Don and a resident, but it's certainly a formative time here at Vine in Toronto. I'm also excited because this is kind of my first chance to talk publicly about my upcoming book, Radical Antiquity, up on the screen here. And this book is sort of an effort to think about how people resisted kind of authoritarian regimes in antiquity and what those acts of resistance might teach us today more broadly. At the center of the book is a pretty basic question, and it's this: what do we mean by this word democracy? So just a brief outline as you keep track of where we're going today. I'm going to begin just by thinking about what we have, the history of that word democracy as it's been applied or not in the case of Canada, and then using kind of two main examples here. So first, that kind of classic side of democracy in antiquity, ancient Athens, and then moving a bit to the open seas here and thinking about maritime democracy, and kind of, I think, some compelling examples there, and then just closing by what that might mean for us today. So democracy is a beloved concept today. It's understood to be basically foundational to the legitimacy of every government, right? We have this idea of popular consent, that we have elected representatives, and this is what makes a government legitimate or not, right? That you choose the government and some people giving power to the government, and that's what makes it legitimate. And as of today, there are exactly 7 countries in the world that do not claim to be democracies, whether in their constitutions or other official documents. Right? So Afghanistan, Brunei, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and what might be the most dangerous and terrifying of all of them, Vatican City, right? But otherwise, this kind of gives us a sense that every country at least wants to claim to be a democracy, with only a handful of exceptions. Even North Korea, right, claims to be the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, even though I don't think most people take seriously the idea that people have a meaningful say in their own governance then, right? Again, just sort of showing that this is foundational to how we think about legitimate governments today. So what's striking is that this universal agreement about democracy as something inherently desirable is in fact a very recent historical development. For most of recorded history, it's been very divisive, even up until quite recently. And so even though we're mostly interested in antiquity today, I'm going to just kind of talk about Canada and kind of way antiquity and Canada overlapped a bit here. Let's just take this man up on screen, Sir John A. Macdonald, our first ever prime minister. And leading up to the Confederation 160 roughly years ago, there's the Quebec Conference in October of 1864, leading up to Confederation. And this is what Sir John A. Macdonald had to say about democracy. We shall have a strong and lasting government under which we can work out our constitutional liberty as opposed to democracy to be able to protect the minority. And on the surface, this sounds actually remarkably progressive, right? That minority rights should be protected and that democracy could be a threat to that, right? That you might have people rising up against some sort of oppressed minority here. Well, I'm going to burst any bubbles that might be there. I can tell you that Sir John A. Macdonald was not thinking, for instance, of immigrants or LGBT people or religious or minorities or anything like that. In fact, in another quotation, he offered exactly what he meant by this word minority, and it's kind of the exact opposite. We must protect the interests of minorities, and the rich are always less numerous than the poor. So perhaps it's just me, but I'm not too worried about the wealthy having the rights taken away by the Canadian government or anything like that, right? And Sir John A. Macdonald was hardly the only father of Confederation to articulate the sentiment that democracy is not what we want Canada to be, right? So Lord Durham, kind of that famous reformer, put forward the idea that a government should be acceptable to the great body of people, is what he said. And many politicians denounced this as something that would lead to a barbaric democracy. Charles Buller, who was a close friend of Lord Durham, wrote that the French Canadians, if rightly managed, are the native instruments by which the government could keep in check the democratic tendencies of Upper Canada, right? So the idea that the federal government has an interest in kind of managing the people of Quebec to make sure democracy doesn't arise here in the province of Ontario, what we today call Ontario. And again, may feel striking here, right? We think of democracy as something so essential to Canada, right? We're a monarchy, and yet that kind of elected body of representatives is foundational to what we think of being part of our democracy, right? It's essential to our governance here. But really, up until recently, basically everybody in Western Europe and North America regarded democracy as a threat to the social order, to the point where it's difficult to find anyone saying anything positive about democracy as a concept. Um, Basically, this goes up until, and we talk about the so-called Western world, right? So here, just kind of Western Europe and North America. Really, it isn't until after the American Revolution that we start to find people using this word democracy at all positively. There's a wonderful article by scholar Francis Dupuy-Derry talking about how Canadians took even longer to really adopt this language of democracy to talk about the country, right? He notes that it wasn't until the 1830s with the patriotic movement that we find kind of these sort of rural Quebecois starting to claim democracy is something that is a term that they want to appropriate. And significantly, it's kind of used in this way that is a bit countercultural, right? Just as an analogy, how the word queer for a long time was something used to deride LGBT people, but since appropriated by LGBT people as a term of identification, we find something similar going on with democracy in the 1830s with the patriotic movement. And even then, this is a small minority of people in one region of what we call Canada. Move on to later, the end of the 19th century, we start to find socialists across Canada using that language of democracy, calling for a more democratic form of government here in Canada. But again, this is a political kind of movement across Canada, but not a majority of the population. It really is not until after World War I that we start to find Canadian politicians themselves regularly and consistently identifying Canada as a democracy, right? So this is quite recent in terms of Canadian history that we think of our country as a democracy. So just briefly taking count of what this is so far, right? So MacDonald and other fathers of the Confederation unanimously condemned democracy as a threat to civil society. Those who did advocate for democracy around that time or later were typically that sort of a minority group engaged in a sort of countercultural type of political enterprise here. And it wasn't until about a century ago that we start to find the word being used positively in a more or less unanimous way across the country. And Canada was not unusual in this regard, perhaps slower than other countries, but it's not unusual. In the United States, only one of the founding fathers identified with democracy. Thomas Jefferson, really the only one of the founding fathers to say democracy is actually a good thing. Everyone else was very much opposed to it. And likewise, France, right? It wasn't until the French Revolution that we started to find kind of the language of democracy being used in a positive way. If anything, there was a strong anti-democratic trend in both Europe and North America until quite recently. And the reasoning behind this, I think, is pretty straightforward and one that Sir Johnny Macdonald has already kind of laid out for us, right? That democracy was understood not as a threat just to civil society, but in particular to a certain class of people with money, namely the wealthy. And since most political writings were produced by these people, by the wealthy, well, it shouldn't surprise us that they don't have anything good to say about democracy, right? The idea that common people should have a say in the government. So my proposal today is pretty straightforward. My main argument is that the reason everybody today agrees about this concept of democracy is because the concept has been watered down significantly from what it meant in earlier times, especially in the context of Greco-Roman antiquity. Basically, we use that term today to denote any form of government that involves elections, right? We think of, we had 2 elections already this year, at least in Ontario. But if you're going to vote for a parliamentarian, if you're going to vote for a city councilor, a mayor, we'd say more or less you're looking at democracy, right? As long as those are open, free elections, we would say that's democracy. As long as this happens on a somewhat intermittent basis, right? 4 or 5 years, or as they're called. So what does this have to do with antiquity? Well, thinking back to Sir John A. Macdonald and others there who are very anti-democratic, well, these are wealthy people, and of course, the wealthy have the best access to education. And so it's no surprise that they were often looking to antiquity for grounds to kind of say democracy is a bunch of baloney. Greco-Roman antiquity provided a lot of that, and particularly influential, at least in Canada, was this ancient historian, arguably the second ever historian, Thucydides. And Thucydides lived in ancient Athens. He wrote this monumental work called The History of the Peloponnesian War, and he detested the city's democracy, right? He thought that this is kind of the cause for a lot of problems and why Athens was ultimately losing this war, the Peloponnesian War, between the Spartans and the Athenians. And of course, he was a very wealthy man. He owned multiple gold mines. Again, multiple gold mines. He's doing quite well off here. So he kind of has this very opportunistic characterization of democracy, kind of highlighting one or another crisis so as to imply that democracy, the involvement of common people within politics, was a threat to peace, freedom, and the security of Athens. Well, Thucydides' work was particularly influential in Canada because of the work of one man, Thomas Hobbes, one of the most famous philosophers of all time. He's an English philosopher who published an English translation, I think maybe the first ever English translation of Thucydides' work. And so anyone who didn't know Attic Greek could now study this work along the way, or at least listen to it and understand it, even if you weren't literate, right? And so Thucydides' own, Hobbes' own political writings and philosophical writings touched on very similar concerns, right? His most famous for his work, Leviathan, 1651, where he argued that basically people should give over a certain amount of freedom so that they can kind of have this sort of civil society. And he was extremely conservative politically. He denounced people in England who advocated wild ideas that people should be able to vote regardless of how much wealth they had, right? Or anyone who was opposed to the monarchy, he ridiculed them as well. And he found an ally in the work of Thucydides, and this is what he had to say. He said Thucydides convinced him that democracy was wrong, and that one man was far wiser than a throng, right? That we should concentrate our power in the hands of a monarch or one or two powerful people here. And so democracy, according to both Hobbes and Thucydides, was something that was dangerous. There's a lot of dangerous potential in it. And Hobbes' own political philosophy was very influential, right? We think the idea of social contract, and a lot of that comes to us through Hobbes there. And his translation of Thucydides is widely read throughout the Anglophone world, not just Canada, but England, the United States, certainly influenced the founding fathers of the United States as well there. And so we often find that Thucydides, among other ancient historians, are cited in sort of anti-democratic screeds of the time, talking about the horrors of democracy in the context of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries there, right? If you're interested, Elspeth Eamon at McGill University has written a wonderful study that talks a lot about how Thucydides influenced anti-democratic tendencies in Canada. So this man Thucydides is immensely wealthy. He's a citizen of Athens, and it's actually worth asking, well, what did democracy mean in ancient Athens as well? Because I can assure you it's quite different from what we mean by this word today. Here we tend to think about democracy in kind of 2 main concepts, right? Electoral democracy, right? That we're going to vote, the act of voting is kind of one of those key aspects. But also election, right? The representative and electoral aspects are kind of 2 key parts of what we think about state democracy today. Significant contrast here would be ancient Athens, which operated on a system of direct democracy. That there was kind of direct debate, decision-making, and most importantly, consensus. So whereas today it takes really only a simple majority of people or simple majority of politicians to impose unpopular laws, or even mere plurality of people to elect an unpopular politician, right? I think when we were looking at what, a month ago, whatever it was, the election results, a lot of people winning at 32% of the vote and stuff like that. Not a majority of the population, certainly not most of the people voting for this, right? Quite a difference from what we talk about ancient Athens, which effectively mandated that all citizens must agree on certain political measures there. And so if there is no consensus, the popular assembly would debate, take suggestions, and ultimately refine the proposal in search of something more agreeable. And this sort of consensus-based system ultimately means that you're finding something that's agreeable to the population. You're not legislating on more divisive matters for the most part, because hey, if everyone has to agree on it, we're not going to make those wacko suggestions that are going to get a lot of people irritated. So individual participation, collective deliberation are key parts of this, and this proved exhilarating for the people of Athens, right? So Pericles, Athens' most famous politician, noted how people really enjoyed this conversation, debate, and compromise. He said that instead of considering discussion an impediment to action, we regard it as a necessary preliminary to any reasonable action. So politics, importantly, was not something that took place over there, right? When we think of politics today, we often think about Queen's Park, we think about Nathan Phillips Square, we think about Ottawa. Rather, it was something where we are, right? Is that kind of collective deliberation in which all can participate. And so for as much as Thucydides and other ancient wealthy people condemned it, democracy certainly seemed to be popular among the vast majority of people in ancient Athens. So no one, I would suggest, in ancient Athens would consider any national government a democracy that we have today. And I'm going to go a step further in saying this. If anything, literally every government today adopts the exact decision-making processes that anti-democratic people in antiquity were advocating. That is to say, they would identify us as being strongly anti-democratic. It's because of one thing, namely our use of representative elections. That representative elections really emerged in an effort to mitigate the power of the common people. So let's just consider how ancient people talked about this. There's one anonymous author in the Old Oligarch. We don't know what his name actually was. He wrote this sort of anonymous piece of writing. And he's this roughly contemporary of Pericles and Socrates, kind of other famous people in Athens. And so around 420 BCE, he wrote this screed that really denounced Athenian democracy on grounds that it empowered the poor. This is what he had to say. One of the things, many things he had to say about it, that democracy gives more power to the worthless, to the impoverished, and the common people than to the wealthy. And these sort of criticisms are very commonplace within ancient literature. The rich had no love for the democracies, the direct democracies anyway, of ancient Greek antiquity, as these systems really ensured that the poorest people had as much say as the wealthy. And so affluent people in Athens tried to find ways of addressing this so as they could kind of sneak in more ways of having their own power there. And there's suggestions, there are a number of different texts in antiquity that say, here's how we should do things instead. And they're more or less all variations on the same suggestion. Namely this, that the city should be run by men of affairs elected as representatives. That really the wealthiest people who have a lot of property, pick the best among them to run our society there. And the reasoning on the one hand is pretty straightforward, right? That these are people who could afford the best education. And they're also who are independently wealthy. So they are able to kind of reflect on matters of public interest, and not to mention kind of deeper concerns like justice, virtue, things like that, right? And so what these people call this system of elections was the word aristocracy. And so even though we use that word aristocracy today to usually talk about, class of wealthy people, right? The Elon Musks of the world and stuff like that, right? People who've got a lot of influence and wealth. In fact, in Greek antiquity, it had two meanings, right? Aristocracy in that sense, but also aristocracy as a political system like democracy. And, aristos, meaning best, kratia meaning power, with the idea that you're putting power into the hands of the best people. And frankly, it's hard to argue against this, right? You can't sound like a reasonable person saying, I don't think the best people should run society. It just sounds like you're one of the biggest fools around to make all the decisions for us. Scroll down here. And so old oligarch had a number of things to say about the sort of aristocratic form of government he was advocating. Um, Throughout the world, the best people, aristos, oppose democracy. For the best men have little debauchery or injustice in them, but are instead deeply concerned with important things. Contrast this with the common folk, demos, hence the word democracy, who contain the utmost ignorance, disorder, and malice within them. Poverty leads them to shameful lives. It is precisely because they do not have money that they remain uneducated and ignorant. So throughout this treatise, the old oligarch deployed a range of different terms to characterize these wealthy people. He calls them the noble, the best, the most effective, the capable, the cleverest, things like this. And he wanted to convince his readers that democracy ultimately would not be reformed, and rather it would require kind of throwing out the Constitution and instituting this form of aristocracy so that men like himself could have power. He said that the Athenian poor really only had their own interests in mind, and whereas, again, people like himself were able to contemplate lofty topics like virtue and so on. And so, although aristocracy purported to put power in the hands of society's best men, today we would probably use different terms to talk about the system of government that they advocate. You know, oligarchy, the rule of the few, right? Or even plutocracy, the rule of the wealthy, right? Stuff that we think was very antithetical to democracy. So elections were first conceptualized as part of this aristocratic form of governance, this aristocratic political system, and they served a pretty clear function to put more influence into the hands of the wealthy. And this makes certain obvious sense, right? Who can afford to run a political campaign? Who can afford a full education or satisfy the tremendous property requirements required to run for office? And so even though we tend to think of elections as a pivotal, or I would go further, fair elections as a pivotal part of our democracy, this was not the case in antiquity. Rather, they understood elections as something opposed to democracy. And over the course of Athenian history, we find that democracy remained a contentious issue. The city's constitution was regularly revised to formalize or to dissolve different class distinctions. And so these changes had a number of significant political implications. Solon, around 594 BCE, instituted kind of four property-based classes as a way of taking away power from kind of the old money people known as the eupatridae. About 90 years later, a man named Cleisthenes did further diluted political powers by creating this fascinating system known as sortition, with the idea that anyone who wanted to become a politician basically stuck their name in a hat, they shook up the hat, and they picked random names out. Anybody had just as good a chance as anyone else. And by creating a lot of political offices there, it kind of meant that you kind of have a good representation of the city there rather than just sort of elected politicians. It would only be a minor overstatement to describe Athenian history as a series of conflicts between these two factions, advocates of popular democracy and the wealthy who sought to take that away and give themselves more power. So the first part of this thesis is that we've really watered down the meaning of this word democracy here. I'd like to press on three essential ways our understanding of democracy today differs from ancient understandings in this regard. First, ancient democracy was participatory, and that people gathered together to collectively make decisions and were even paid by the government to attend and participate in these, right? So just to really encourage as much civic engagement as possible. Second, democracy was adaptive, and that it really hadn't, I would say, ossified into a sort of rules that are unchanging, but rather they kind of took it as something that could be adapted to one or another crisis as they emerged. And finally, it was designed to really prevent the accumulation of power into the hands of one person. So for instance, by the sort of system of sortition, randomly choosing politicians, but Athenians also famously had a system of ostracism, where once a year you could gather people up, and if 6,000 people named the same person, that person was out of town for 10 years, right? Hey, it's hard to imagine almost any politician we have today passing that test. I feel like most politicians here are quite unpopular in that regard there. But But again, it's worth emphasizing what is implied in all this. Those things that we regard as most essential to our democracy, that is the occasional election of representatives, emerged as an expressly anti-democratic innovation designed to undercut the will and the power of the general populations. Elections were essentially an aristocratic form of government designed to address the resentments of the wealthy and prevent common people from becoming involved in politics, right? Those resources required to run for office, money, time, influence, popularity, rhetorical skill, were primarily available to the wealthiest in society. What I find even more fascinating than the democracy of Athens itself was how common people addressed the shortcomings of Athenian democracy in its own right. So to state the obvious, Athenian democracy is far from perfect. Women couldn't become citizens and vote. They're slaves. There's no pathway to citizenship for immigrants. I myself am an immigrant to Canada. I finally got citizenship a couple of years ago. So people like myself would never be able to participate in this meaningful system. And in any sort of Greek city-state, roughly 5 to 20% of the population were citizens, meaning the vast majority of people, women, slaves, immigrants, are unable to participate. So how did those people, that kind of 80 to 90% of the population in any given city, address these shortcomings? This is what the book that I write is sort of about. Well, I don't have time to get into a ton of them, but I'm going to pick one example that I find is pretty fascinating. And the inner child in me couldn't help but pick this, namely pirates. We all love pirates. You might think back to Captain Jack Sparrow and all that stuff. Well, pirates of what we call the Hellenistic period are pretty fascinating. Hellenistic period refers to basically the time after Alexander's conquest, around 330 BCE, up until the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean East in 63 BCE. And to understand why piracy offers some pretty fascinating insights into the functioning of democracy, it may help to first think about why people would turn towards piracy, right? Giving up a sort of legitimate life, perhaps working as a sailor to kind of hoist the ancient version of the Jolly Roger there. Well, after Alexander the Great's conquest in 330 BCE, there were several empires throughout the Mediterranean competing for economic supremacy through maritime trade. Out in Italy, you've got the Roman Republic. In North Africa, you've got the Carthaginian Empire. You've also got the Ptolemaic Egypt as well there. You've got the Seleucid Kingdom in what we today call Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Not to mention the Antiquity Kingdom in would be Macedonia, and a handful of other kind of smaller states there as well. And these are kind of competing to gain access to the most important resources economically at the time, right? So Egyptian grain, Greek wine, Spanish metals, dyed tiles from Syria, and of course, the horrors of antiquity, right? Human chattel to be sold as slaves. And so as maritime trade developed, a handful of people became immensely wealthy. And these people, what they typically do is they would hire a captain of a ship, and he was basically dictator over the ship, while the rest of the crew, literally everyone else, consisted of slaves, the bankrupt, or people who are otherwise easily exploited. The aristocracy generated immense wealth through these merchant ships, but they felt no love at all for the sailors that actually performed the labor that made them so wealthy. Roman politician Cicero here had this to say. He derided sailors as men of low status, born in obscure places, traveling to regions they've never seen before, where they are neither known to strangers whom they visit, nor can they be acquaintances who can vouch for them, right? And if you know Greco-Roman antiquity, those concepts of honor and shame and reputation are very key. And sailors, right? There's a good chance these are people running away from money, slavery, something like that. People who are understood to be inherently disreputable by the standards of the time there. And so the crews on these legitimate merchant ships consisted of society's most destitute people, an assortment of cast-offs, runaways, fugitives, slaves, things like that. There's one Christian writer who's roughly contemporaneous with Augustine, named Synesius, and he has this kind of interesting letter he writes to his brother about a ship he's sailing on, and he's alarmed at how the sailors are referring to each other. They don't seem to call each other by names, but by their physical oddities, right? Hey, knobby knees, yo, hernia, listen up, lefty, over here, squinty, just calling each other by their physical oddities rather than their actual names. And many other people in antiquity share this feeling of disgust for people working on the sea. There's one Roman law that even refers to merchant crews as men of the worst quality. And you can get a sense for their poverty by looking at ancient artwork, as they're consistently depicted either naked or nearly naked, indicating their slave status or slave life status. Here's an example here. So these merchant ships operated with a very rigid hierarchy, where insubordination was met with corporal punishment. There's one text that tells about how a captain beat every person on the crew with 40 lashes because of an old superstition being violated. Shouldn't get your hair cut before you sail out the next day. Someone did that, the whole crew got beat because of it. There's also another law from, I can't remember which Hellenistic empire it is, but a Hellenistic law that mentions the brand. So kind of, you think of cattle brands being a distinguishing mark. Well, this law talks about the brand being a distinguishing mark upon sailors as well. They're typically reserved in livestock. So sailors' lives are really defined by exploitation. Everyone below the captain bears all the risk, and yet the owners and their agents reap all the rewards. But the average crewman doesn't have much to look forward to either, right? The accounts seem to be that when he's on shore, he spends his shore leave either drowning his sorrows in alcohol or sleeping with sex workers, right? He's not able to kind of form more permanent relationships because you're kind of sailing from port to port. And so that's the only thing available to them. So it's sort of authoritarian system that breeds a lot of resentment. And this is striking because being a sailor, whether today or antiquity, requires an immense combination of skill, brute strength, and often a willingness to risk one's life on a regular basis, depending on the type of sailing. And yet the few people capable of this were treated like livestock. So perhaps it's not surprising that many sailors abandon this sort of legitimate work of these vessels on merchant vessels to use their skill sets to talk or to engage in more lucrative adventures. Most pirates, we know, were disaffected seamen, and many were mutineers from the vessels that they stole from their owners there. There's one law from Egypt that talks about how sailors turn rogue. This law kind of concerns enslaved sailors aboard barges run by basically Egyptian royalty who went absent without leave. And this law is striking because it basically equates fugitive sailors with bandits, clearly indicating that these are people who became pirates. So many sailors abandoned these merchant ships that had these really regimented expectations in favor of piracy, which granted them a lot more freedom. When sailors abandoned these sort of authoritarian merchant ships, they organized themselves in actually profoundly egalitarian ways. Pirates preferred non-hierarchical decision-making, what was often referred to as horizontal leadership today. So although they elected their own captains, what's noteworthy is that their captains actually held almost no authority at all. The very few privileges available to the captain are that they can have the power to command and issue orders on the ship in battle. It's really in battle alone. In all other respects, they're equal to the crew. And of course, why do they have this power? It sort of makes sense, right? In the context of battle, it's often split-second decision-making can make all the difference between a wise move and a poor move. And so if you've invested your authority in one person that you all trust, kind of makes sense to do so. But in every other regard, the captain seems to have been an equal of the crew. This meant that pirates implemented democratic decisions in all non-emergency contexts. And many texts indicate the seriousness with which they took their democratic governance. So in one of them, we read this. When the pirates arrived and the rest of the crowd gathered, the captain Thymus, depicted here, seated himself on a mound and declared the island a popular assembly. So Thymus, this pirate captain, then goes on to address his fellow pirates, his comrades, and reminds them that his share of the loot is no more than anyone else's, right? He's not a captain who's getting, the best gold or anything, same as everyone else there. And the scene is depicted with this really striking legal formality, right? It's using a lot of legal terminology and vocabulary that we otherwise find typical of ancient democracies. Pirates really go out of the way to limit the power of their captain, ensuring the equitable distribution of goods and also guaranteeing the rights of the crew. Pirates were very insistent about these egalitarian ideals. One novel claims that after pirates looted a ship, they divided spoils in equal shares. And the first person to be able to pick their spoils out of everyone was not the captain, but rather the first one man to run on the opposing ship and draw blood. Likewise, Cicero, the politician from a few slides ago, noted that, quote, if any pirate captain failed to distribute booty equitably among his crew, he'd be abandoned or even killed by his comrades. So even mild abuse of authority or kind of acting in self-interest is what possibly a risky decision for any pirate captain to make with their own life on the line there, right? Of course, when you think of pirates, these are people who are mutineers who are already and regularly showing their willingness to engage in violence. So kind of the sort of equaling structure there that we find in these things. Outside of battles, important decisions required the deliberation of the entire crew in these popular assemblies. These were usually ad hoc councils contemplating a single, possibly divisive issue, ranging perhaps from what to do with captives aboard the ship to where you might pursue your next conquest. And the sources agree that these popular assemblies really welcome proposals from the crew, which were then debated. And although the captain has the opportunity to offer the first proposal, he's the crew's equal in all other regards in these popular assemblies. And once these proposals were considered and debated, people take a vote. And of course, unanimity is preferable and seems to be a ground for celebration. But a majority vote was sufficient to resolve the issue. If no majority emerged, and one of two things happened. Either action was deferred until there's further development, or again, these are pirates, a brawl might ensue and people might get in a fight, right? Good chance a lot of them are drunk while this is going on. Pirate constitutions strikingly also codified protections for women, children, and disabled comrades who lived on land, but remained under their care as well. They even kept a common fund for those in need as well. So I think when we think of their welfare state today, a lot of this is anticipated within Antiquity as well. So historian Nicholas Rowe goes on to conclude that Hellenistic piracy was a movement in social reform with thousands of armed seamen organizing themselves into anarchic yet highly motivated democracies, more stable communities, and a more fair and equitable social system. And I want to highlight the word anarchic there. What he means by this is not chaotic, although I'm sure there was some chaotic, but what he's really referring to in this sense is anarchic in that ancient Greek sense of without a leader. That there's kind of a leaderless system, horizontal leadership is what Nicholas Rowe is getting at with this. Again, all this is quite a far cry from what these pirates would have experienced way back when they're on merchant cruise, right? Those authoritarian ships they were on back in those days, quite a difference there. And so any pirate captain who did tend towards that sort of authoritarian style risked his crew's sedition, right? There's a good chance they would rebel, engage in mutiny themselves. So, how did this remarkably sophisticated set of democracies come to be, right? Constitutions, consensus, voting, equitable shares. Well, this may not really sound like the type of thing that most people would expect from illiterate outlaws living thousands of years ago, right? But in fact, I'm going to argue that it was precisely these factors that put ancient pirates in an excellent decision to come up with more democratic decision-making processes. Other democracies not only comprised escaped slaves, outlaws, and bankrupt peasants, but also empowered them in ways that were unimaginable in their previous lives as slaves aboard a merchant ship. So I'm going to suggest two particular factors here in the recipe for radical self-organization, a combination of demographic diversity, armed resistance, and crew solidarity were these sort of powerful contributors to their democracies. I'll take each of these in turn here. So first, Hellenistic pirates were extremely diverse in their origins. The Roman historian Appian writes that pirates during this time period consisted of destitute seamen from Cilicia, Syria, Cyprus, Pamphylia, Pontus, and all those eastern nations. So basically the whole eastern Mediterranean coastline there. And various other texts mention pirates from Liguria, Illyria, Crete, Judea, Arabia, and other coastal lands as well. Such diversity, of course, probably presented a lot of problems, right? People may not all know the same language. or there's different cultures, accents, practices, and so on. So being even able to understand each other probably wasn't the easiest thing. But that said, such diversity also meant that pirate crews brought together people familiar with a wide range of different decision-making processes, right? The places that Appian mentions here all had unique ways of governing themselves. So one of the city-states that he mentions had implemented extensive measures to care for the disabled and poor, for instance. And not too far from that one, another implemented a system that reduced the number of civic officials to a practical minimum, right? So in the same way pirates had one captain and not really any other officers, also some of these other ones. And likewise, any Romans who were turning pirates were familiar with that system of voting and referenda as well. And so I would suggest that the abundant diversity of the Mediterranean was visible on the board of any particular pirate crew, with individual members hailing from different places and bringing distinctive political experiences with them. The second ingredient in pirate democracy was their combat proficiency and experience. Aristotle, the good philosopher, had this interesting observation in some of his political writings. He observed that you can actually determine what a political governance of any given city is going to look like based on its military. So if you have a cavalry, for instance, well, horses are expensive to maintain, arm, and so on. So it's really only going to be the wealthiest that got much political power if your main portion of your army is cavalry. If it includes heavy infantry, well, you're going to include people of moderate wealth as well, because those are people also engaging there. But Aristotle goes on through this list, and he only says, if you have a navy, well, any able-bodied person can row a boat. And so really, even the poorest person is enfranchised and able to vote in those contexts. And David Graeber explains why this is the case here, the anthropologist. He says this: underlying the institution of majoritarian voting was a rather commonsensical idea that if a man is armed, his opinions had to be taken into account. Ancient military units often elected their own officers. It's also easy to see why majority voting would make sense in a military unit. Even if a vote was 60-40, both sides were armed. If it did come down to a fight, you could easily see who immediately was most likely to win. Pirate ships, which were military operations, used majority vote. So this is to say that collective decision-making is never easy, right? And we get people who have weapons in hand, well, it's possible it escalates to bloodshed, especially when debate gets heated. There's also the risk that people might try to impose their will upon others as well. So historically speaking, majoritarian voting, right, so majority rules, has historically served to prevent such violence, particularly when these groups consist of social equals who are armed. And certainly pirates have been defined by their willingness to use armed force. The final ingredient I would suggest was a shared experience of exploitation and isolation at sea. So back before there were sailors working on merchant ships, they were a uniquely alienated group of people. There was no way for them to separate their daily life from their work. They lived without autonomy or privacy, and they experienced immense emotional and physical abuse, were deprived of meaningful social ties, right? Their relationship with family or loved ones is not really possible. And they had nowhere to call home, right? If you're on the seas as a slave, you've got no city you can call your own. And yet, despite these awful conditions, their work required specialized skill sets and immense trust in their crewmates, right? You really have to trust people on board a ship, especially if it's a large one. And so being at sea, sailors' closest friends are no doubt his crewmates. You can only imagine how many games or dire situations any pirates would have shared in common there, right? And so the resulting seclusion kind of pitted sailors against the rest of the world, which in turn contributed to a really strong sense of solidarity that we otherwise really don't find in the ancient world. They regarded each other as comrades in a way that was very rare in any given occupation. And so Socrates, the philosopher, observed that pirates could hardly succeed if they began committing injustices against each other. And Cicero, that same politician, observed that they could not survive without some canons of justice among themselves, hence the rule honor among thieves, which they were all obliged to observe. There's numerous accounts also, I would observe, of pirate crews helping out other pirate ships for no reason other than a sense of solidarity, right? See a pirate crew stranded or maybe undergoing battle, we often find tales of them helping each other out there. So this combination of demographic diversity, armed resistance, and crew solidarity were powerful contributors to pirates' democratic impulses. David Graeber, that anthropologist I mentioned not too long ago, makes a profound observation about pirates of what we call the golden age of pirates, right? So this would be like the 18th, 17th century. You can go again, Captain Jack Sparrow, Blackbeard, excuse me, among others. But he may talk about them, but I think it also applies to the Greco-Roman antiquity. This is what he has to say. We're dealing with a collection of people in which there was likely to be at least some firsthand knowledge of a very wide range of directly democratic institutions, suddenly find themselves forced to improvise some mode of self-government in the complete absence of any state. It's a perfect intercultural space of experiment. There's likely to be no more conducive ground for the development of new democratic institutions. In other words, the motley crews manning these pirate ships were not impediments to democracy, but assets to their radical forms of governance. Invested in their own survival, they developed participatory forms of governance that were custom made to their situation. So my time is running low here, so I'm going to just slide into my conclusion here. Athenian democracy and the democracy of Hellenistic pirates, at least on superficial discussion, would seem to hold little in common, right? Athens was a powerful merchant empire of immense wealth, whereas pirate crews consisted of small bands of escaped slaves pillaging what they could from unsuspecting passers-by. But I think this understanding does injustice to the significant similarities in their understanding of democracy, particularly in contrast to modern understandings of democracy. Let me wrap up just by returning to the 3 points I mentioned before about differences between ancient and modern democracies. I also think they're shared pretty well between pirates and Athenian democracy. So first, democracy was adaptive, right? The Athenian constitution was regularly reformed so as to ensure that loopholes were closed and power remained in the hands of the common people. I mentioned before how Cleisthenes reformed that constitution in 508 BCE so as to dilute the powers of the wealthy and institute that system of sortition, namely that kind of randomly choosing public audience, such that anyone could participate. Likewise, pirate crews had their own distinctive constitutions, right, from one ship to the next, that were designed to fit the needs of that particular crew. There was no sense of democracy being essentially unchangeable. Second, democracy flourished when it prevented the accumulation of power. Both pirates and ancient Athenians were in some sense anarchistic in that sense of leaderlessness, right? They did not have a sort of powerful head of state there. And again, I'm not referring to chaos, but that way in which people can kind of collaborate together as equals. They believe there should not be leaders or authorities that you need to bow your head to. The Athenian system of sortition prevented anyone from accumulating too much power, and likewise, pirate captains were basically just first among equals, except when it came to battle. Both populations recognize democracy requires no person hold authority over anyone else. Third and finally, democracy was understood to be participatory, right? In our own democratic systems here in Canada, it often means little more than just going to vote every handful of years at provincial, civic, and federal levels. This couldn't be any more different from ancient conceptions of democracy. Here we find often very little space for kind of public debate or participation in these democratic processes, aside perhaps from acts of protest or sending an email to your MP, who knows if they even read it type thing, right? If we truly are a country that prioritizes peace, order, and good government, then I might suggest that we start to reassess our systems of governance and what they might look like. Thank you.
Would you mind to take the questions from there? If there are any questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions?
Yes, thanks so much. Fascinating, and thanks for all your hard work and research. I'm so curious about the Zoroastrians that you mentioned.
Sure.
Can you just give us one sentence left?
Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah, the subtitle of the book, I'll repeat it just in case those online can't hear the question anyway. So the question was the subtitle of the book, Free Love Zoroastrians, Farming Pirates, Ancient Uprisings. Well, I've talked a little bit about pirates and so on, but those Free Love Zoroastrians, what exactly is that is what the question is here, right? So in this case, with the book, I've got a chapter devoted to a Zoroastrian sect known as the Masakites. And so over the course of late antiquity, living in what we today call Iran and Iraq, the Zoroastrian sect that was kind of this popular revolt against the mainstream Zoroastrian church. And kind of within that, developing different systems of marriage. In this case, it was what's called polyandrous marriage. So one woman would marry multiple men. So quite a bit different there, and just kind of thinking about why they did that, and how that kind of serves sort of democratic needs within the community, and thinking about it from a sort of feminist perspective there. So that's clarifying.
Yeah, very helpful, thanks. Yeah.
Wonderful question. Thank you.
For me, what is very interesting is that when you discuss the development, that in the beginning people was against democracy because they wanted to protect the privileges of a few. I think today we can argue that democracy is used to protect the privilege of a few.
Yeah, so kind of that kind of parallel there, right? That democracy initially being understood as a threat against the few, but now I think, yeah, certainly we look at ways in which, I mean, it's hard to talk about this without getting a little bit political, so I hope people don't mind anyway. But my home country, the United States, I think we see right now where kind of democratic institutions are being used in certain ways to really benefit just a handful of people there that I don't think represent the interests of most people anyway.
You said that, not me.
Online question here. Do you have any additional book recommendations that delve deeper into the topics you discussed this morning?
Sure. So I'll repeat that for people who didn't hear it. So do you have any book recommendations for people wanting to delve in these topics deeper? So I would say in the book itself, book is a great place to start. And I would say, for what it's worth, that each chapter does have a sort of further reading if you're interested in any of the topics there. But I do think David Graeber, book a few years ago, The Dawn of Everything, that he wrote with David Wengrow. He also solo wrote a book called The Democracy Project, which was quite influential on this as well. My own presentation here, thinking about kind of what we mean by this word democracy, how has that changed over time, and kind of what does the future of democracy look like? So I think those are two places he looks at history, but also some good theorization with it. There's also I don't know that he's published any books in English anyway, but some very good articles by I think he's a Italian scholar, but teaching in Scotland. Mirko Caravano has done excellent work on sort of the shape of Athenian democracy as well. So Google him and you'll find he's got some good stuff up on his academia.edu profile there. So yeah, thank you for the question.
How long has this whole process been for you? Like, when did you start sort of this book sort of taking shape and form?
Sure, yeah. So the question, I'll just repeat it for those online here. So the question was, how long this kind of the shaping process and putting it together and so on. Kind of it was multiple steps, right? So I think, I'm a biblical scholar by training. Certainly there's parts of early Christian sect, the circumcellions are talked about here along with the Donatists. But I think for me, I teach at TNU, and I live in Toronto, which is a remarkably diverse city, right? And I think one thing that alarms me, and I teach ancient Greece and Rome, is how there's a strain of white supremacy in popular perception of ancient Greece and Rome, right? That this is often understood to be the golden age of the white man in a way that is not representative of reality, right? The Antiquity was diverse, the Mediterranean was diverse. I think just a number of conversations with students kind of initially got me thinking about this. But in terms of the writing and research process, I think it's maybe been about 1.5 2 years or so. Yeah, but it's been very fun to write. Each chapter is kind of a distinctive community, society, so kind of self-contained a little bit in that regard. It's been fun to just kind of go through each of those and look at wild different ways that people have lived in service of kind of looking at democracy there, right? Yeah, thank you.
Do it.
So the great Athenian philosophers themselves were not positive towards democracy. Aristotle categorized it, which you can help us with. But some of what you were talking about really also you can see how Plato is kind of mainstream, far more than we think, in terms of thinking that the best society was the rule of the wisest.
Absolutely. So I'll just repeat this. So kind of this just to talk about kind of the philosophers, the well-known philosophers of antiquity, really all philosophers of antiquity don't have much positive to say about democracy, right? At best, they tend to talk about it as something that is better than tyranny, but that it's still something dangerous, right? So Plato, Socrates, I think that there are literally no writings from the pen of someone who's pro-democracy in antiquity. We have kind of speeches that were recorded by someone else, of Pericles or whatever, giving a pro-democracy speech, and then Thucydides trash talks it afterward or something like that. But there's a very strong strain of anti-democracy within these philosophers. And I think a lot of it's connected to a number of different things, right? So I think these are independently wealthy people, right? Is one part of that. And I think that to the extent that they don't have power, right? So Aristotle himself was not a citizen of Athens, right? He's not able to actually vote or participate in these systems. And so he's wanting to claim power for himself in one way, but he doesn't see a place for himself in democracy as well because he's kind of inherently excluded from that. I say perhaps as a point of contrast, we might think also like the Cynic philosophers, right? Where these are often people who are born of slaves, foreigners as well, so immigrants not able to vote. And they kind of adapt democracy in a very different way, right? In a very populist formation, unlike, say, Plato's Academy and so on, right? So yeah, certainly this is one of those concepts that lingers underneath, I think, a lot of writings of antiquity, the shape of what politics should be, right? So yeah, absolutely. Did you look like
I was going to follow up on the same thing.
Yeah.
But even Karl Marx, is talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah.
Who is a particular social class. He doesn't have a lot of time for those below the proletariat.
Right.
The lumpen proletariat. So there always seems to be this sense that those with money are worried that if they give power to those without money.
Yeah. Even Marx too, right? That's a great observation, right? When we think of kind of that, the social equalizer par excellence, right? Hardly actually the case that there is the sense that there's people who we don't want to get their voices in there, right? This is not to say that everyone needs to win, right? There's many people who hold horrendous political views that obviously we don't want their view to win out. But I think we see the state, honestly, right? By marginalizing certain types of people, there's these echo chambers that emerge that can lead to this really dangerous radicalization that happens with that. And I do think democracy can be an antidote about that, right? That by kind of including larger conversations that can kind of mitigate against these dangerous echo chambers today. A bit different from the lumpen proletariat there, but I think kind of how we do marginalize certain political views. Yeah, I think these are great observations. Thank you, Stuart. I think I saw your hand up on the corner. Yeah.
So, and maybe you get into this in the book, but how do we redeem democracy?
Sure. I think there's a lot of different possibilities here, right? I do think one thing I would suggest, I think democracy works most effectively in like localized ways, right? And this isn't just to say city in front needs to change its government, but how we run our families, our communities and stuff like that, our churches, whatever the case may be, are we doing those in a democratic way that empowers people as much as possible? I think that kind of starting at the local level can be a great way of doing things. And I think that debate, conversation, listening, and so on is a big part of this. I think consensus is also a really good way of thinking about it, right? Because consensus isn't so much unanimity as it is making a decision that at least no one hates, right? It doesn't need to be perfectly agreeable, but we can all live with it, right? And that's often, I think, the best way to start thinking about democracy is not who's winning and who's losing, but how can we create something that's at least not offensive to everybody? We can all kind of get along well enough with what this church or what this community, what our family or whatever is agreeing upon there. So, but certainly we get more into it there. Great question as well, right? How do we take this forward as we move on, right?
Any more questions?
I've been thinking a lot about mercantilism because, John A. Macdonald was at his heart a mercantilist. And I think of the free trade debates in Canada, the early 20th century. And because of course tariffs are the tool of mercantilism. So it rears its ugly head again.
Yeah, well, economics is so hard to separate from these things, right? Absolutely. Didn't recognize you with the goatee, Gord. The voice I recognize, of course, now I recognize you perfectly there. But yeah, so economics is of course so hard to separate from this. And you're right, that kind of the mercantile economy of ancient Athens, those ships in the Hellenistic Mediterranean that turned into that, like you said as well, right? That kind of between the New World and Europe as well, creating that space for piracy. And again, very democratic. I'd say you went a fascinating discussion of kind of the golden age of pirates and Marcus Rediker's work. It's just absolutely fascinating about kind of how people organized in that golden age of piracy as well there. But good to see you, Gord. Yeah, sorry, I didn't recognize you with the goatee there.
Any more questions?
Sure, I'm not sure if I have a question. I was looking at your categories there. And one of the things that I remember finding interesting was after 2008 and the financial crisis, you had the Occupy Wall Street movement, which probably is the closest thing to Athenian democracy, where you have direct participation. So it ticks a lot of those boxes, but it utterly failed because you had an initial unifying point that everyone was gathered around, that we need to hold Wall Street accountable for everything. But as it grew, it spread nationwide and into Toronto as well. But in New York particularly, you had lots of other people with lots of other interests that glommed on to that movement. And you had these circles, decision-making circles and that sort of thing, but nobody could agree on anything because there was no longer any unifying purpose. And it just sort of petered out in disorganization and irrelevance and confusion and that sort of thing. And so I find it interesting that even in Athenian democracy, when you really needed to have something done, you appointed a dictator to take over in moments of crisis. And even the cost of, there was a barrier to entry where you had to be someone who had a stake in the community long-term, so landowners, right?
Yeah.
And I found it interesting that in an honor-shame culture, one of the things that struck against sailors is they had no one to vouch for them, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have that, you limit participation in those cases to keep government effective for the long-term success of your community. You limit it to those people who have skin in the game, kind of thing. And certain different kinds of democracies do that better than representative democracies do that better than others. But there is a point where you get to a point where it's no longer effective. It becomes so participatory and fragmented that it's not effective. But anyway, yeah, I said I didn't have a question, but it's fascinating and a lot of very interesting contemporary applications to what you're doing.
Absolutely. I'll just repeat some of that briefly for those online. But one of the things that Dr. Owens is talking about here is sort of the size and recent examples of sort of Occupy Wall Street, initially beginning with kind of a clear focus and eventually growing in such a way that you kind of find all these I don't know, parasitical relationship, but it didn't end up working out very well, certainly in the long run. It fizzled out after a handful of months, despite being immensely popular, having a lot of people invested in it. And I do think you're right, that size is a key part of what we think about with sort of participatory democracy, right? That, the Athenian agora, all these sorts of things, right? There's a lot of people who would be participating in these institutions. Not everyone's come to every meeting. You try to pay people to come to them. But I think there's often limits to what is possible with each type of democracy, right? And so how to engage that effectively becomes tricky. I also think, we look at other sources of democracy here in Canada. There's been some very good work done in terms of the influence of the Haudenosaunee on the shape of US and Canadian democracy, right? So kind of confederations, right? People might have been reading about the federations of, antiquity, but you're actually looking at the federations that exist as you're putting together, the United States Constitution or whatever. Well, you're looking towards indigenous people as well, right? So I think that those are kind of interesting ways that also shaped how our democracies function here within Canada, the United States as well. Yeah, absolutely. So there's certainly limits. I would absolutely agree with that.
Thank you, Brian. Any more questions? That is my privilege, Christopher, to say thank you to you. It's always so interesting that, sometimes you don't realize people doing research on certain topics that you don't even know exist. It's one of these, but thank you so much. So I also want to thank Jenny. Jenny, you've shown so much determination and tenacity to get this done, to make it part of the Alumni Week. And I appreciate it, Jenny. Thank you so much also for that. And thank you for the attendance. The 15 people attended online, so you had an audience of 26 people. And thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this.
Stuff in the middle.
Yeah, birthday.
It's birthdays, but.
My daughter.
Just-
I did not. I wouldn't mind the link as well, just so I can share with anybody.
Yeah, but how bilateral.
Like, I think it's cool.
Oh, okay, so they're packing. All right, that's easy to find out.
But I will.
I liked it.
No, that's all right. It's just pre-order station now, so it's not like you go to buy it.
Did you watch this stage?
Yeah.